In 1067, the Caliph of Egypt, the man who controlled Jerusalem, the Nile Delta, and one of the greatest treasuries in the medieval world, watched his own soldiers carry his furniture out of the palace and sell it in the market to buy food. He had no money to stop them. He had no authority they would listen to. He sat down in an empty room on a reed mat that was the only thing they had left him and waited to see if anyone would bring him something to eat. The ruler of the most important Islamic caliphate in the world was sitting on a mat in an empty palace in a starving city, wondering if he would survive the week. The caliphate that had reduced him to this was the Fatimid Caliphate, a dynasty that had controlled Egypt for nearly 100 years, that had built Cairo from nothing into one of the great cities of the world, that maintained what was probably the largest library on earth, and that at its peak controlled not just Egypt but Jerusalem, Palestine, Syria, Sicily, North Africa, Yemen, Mecca, and Medina. The man sitting on the mat was Caliph Al-Mustansir Billah. He had been caliph since the age of 7. He would reign for 58 years in total, the longest reign of any Fatimid caliph, and most of those years were spent as a prisoner of his own palace, dependent on whoever happened to be the strongest man in the room. The story of how the Fatimid Caliphate went from controlling the most important real estate in the medieval world to a caliph sitting on a mat in an empty palace is not a story of military conquest. No great enemy army defeated the Fatimids in the field. What happened was something more banal and more catastrophic. The Nile did not flood. The rains failed in the Ethiopian highlands. The river that had sustained Egyptian civilization for 3,000 years ran low for 7 consecutive years. And in those 7 years, the Fatimid Caliphate, its treasury, its library, its army, its territory, was destroyed from the inside. The Fatimid Caliphate began not in Egypt but in North Africa. In 909 CE, a religious leader claiming descent from Fatima, the daughter of Muhammad, declared himself caliph in what is now Tunisia. He was the first Fatimid caliph, and his claim was both political and theological. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad was illegitimate, a usurpation. The true line of leadership ran through the Prophet's family, through Shia Islam, through the Ismaili branch that the Fatimids represented. This made the Fatimids the great rivals of the Abbasid Sunni world. 2 caliphates, both claiming to be the true leader of all Muslims, watching each other across the Mediterranean. For 60 years, the Fatimids controlled North Africa and built their power. Then, in 969 CE, they made their decisive move. A Fatimid general named Jawhar al-Sakili, the Sicilian, led an army into Egypt, which was at the time weakly governed and easily taken. Jawhar did not sack the existing city of Fustat. He built a new city next to it, Al-Qahira, the victorious, Cairo. He built it in a deliberate grid with a palace at the center for the caliph who would follow him. Then he built Al-Azhar Mosque and University, still in operation today, over 1,000 years later, as the intellectual heart of the new Fatimid order. Egypt was not just conquered, it was redesigned from the ground up. For the next century, the Fatimid Caliphate was one of the most sophisticated states in the world. Cairo's population grew to hundreds of thousands. The palace complex occupied a significant portion of the city and was described by every visitor as almost impossibly magnificent. Textiles, gold, artworks, animals from across the known world. The Fatimid library, called the Dar al-Ilm, the House of Knowledge, accumulated perhaps 100,000 volumes, perhaps more, philosophy, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, law, poetry, history. When foreign scholars described it, they ran out of words. The Fatimid treasury dazzled every ambassador who was shown it, and the trade networks from the Mediterranean through the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean made Egypt the commercial hub of the medieval world. The Fatimids also controlled what Christians and Muslims both agreed was the most important city on earth. Jerusalem had been under Fatimid rule since 969 CE. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the site of Jesus' burial and resurrection according to Christian belief, was in their territory. Christian pilgrims traveled to Jerusalem throughout the Fatimid period, and for most of that period the Fatimids allowed them. There had been an exception. The mad Caliph al-Hakim, who reigned from 996 to 1021, destroyed the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in 1009 and briefly persecuted Christians and Jews. But his successors reversed his policies, and the caliphate returned to relative tolerance. Jerusalem was one of the prizes the Fatimids held. They were about to lose it. The structural weakness beneath the Fatimid splendor was the army. The The Fatimid military was not a national army with a unified loyalty to the state. It was a coalition of ethnic mercenary groups who served for pay and who had no particular loyalty to each other or to the dynasty. The three main factions were Turkish soldiers, Central Asian mercenaries who were the most militarily capable and also the most violent and independent, Berber soldiers, from the North African homeland of the Fatimid dynasty, increasingly resentful of being outcompeted by the Turks, and Sudanese soldiers, Sub-Saharan African troops who were personally loyal to Caliph al-Mustanzir's mother, herself a woman of Sudanese origin who had enormous informal power at court. These three groups hated each other with the intensity of rivals who had to share the same payroll. Egypt's entire civilization was built on a single mechanism, the annual flood of the Nile. Every summer, rains in the Ethiopian highlands swelled the Blue Nile, which raised the main Nile, which flooded the banks, which deposited black silt across the fields of the delta, which receded and left behind the richest farmland in the ancient world. The Egyptians had built a civilization that could feed millions on this schedule for 3,000 years. The flood was measured every year at the Nilometer on Rhoda Island in Cairo, an ancient stone column marked with the ideal water levels. Too low, no silt, no crop, famine. Too high, destructive floods. The ideal was precise. For most of Fatimid history, it was reliable enough. In 1065, it stopped being reliable. The first sign was the flood of 1065. Low. Not catastrophically low, but low enough that the harvest was reduced. Prices rose. The granaries began to be drawn down. The government took measures to manage the shortage. Rationing, price controls, appeals for calm. No one panicked yet because low floods happened occasionally and were usually followed by recovery. The problem was what came next. The flood of 1066 was also low, and 1067, and 1068, and 1069, and 1070, and 1071. 7 consecutive years of low or failed Nile flood. Whatever had changed in the Ethiopian highland rainfall patterns had not changed back. Egypt was running out of food and the process showed no sign of stopping. By 1067, the famine was real and spreading. In Cairo, bread prices had risen to levels that ordinary people could not pay. Markets that had been full of grain were empty or had prices only the wealthy could afford. In the countryside, the fields that depended on the Nile silt produced almost nothing. The Fatimid government had the worst possible problem, not just a shortage of food, but a shortage of money to buy food from elsewhere, because the same agricultural failure that destroyed the harvest also destroyed the tax revenue that funded the treasury. The government was becoming poor at exactly the moment it needed to be rich to manage the crisis. The army factions, seeing the pay beginning to fail, made a rational calculation. If the government can no longer pay us, we will pay ourselves. The Turkish military commanders began extracting money and goods from the population, effectively taxing at sword point what the government could no longer tax legitimately. The Sudanese troops did the same in their areas of influence. The Berbers held their own territory in Upper Egypt. Each faction was now a private army of extraction, competing not with foreign enemies but with the population they had been employed to protect. And they competed with each other. Armed clashes between Turkish and Sudanese factions became open warfare in the streets of Cairo. In 1067 and 1068, the Turkish military commanders did something that shocked the medieval Islamic world. They systematically looted the Fatimid palace and treasury. Not a robbery in the night. A deliberate, organized stripping of one of the greatest accumulations of wealth in medieval history. The textiles went first, then the gold and silver objects, then the jewels and artworks, then the books. The Fatimid Library, the House of Knowledge, 100,000 volumes of philosophy, science, medicine, and literature, was dismantled. Some books were sold to be used as fuel. Others were sold for their covers and their pages repurposed. The content, the ideas, the scholarship, the centuries of accumulated learning, was scattered to the wind. Caliph al-Mustanzir watched this happen. He had no power to stop it. The army that was supposed to obey him was the army doing the looting. Contemporary sources describe the scene in the palace with a kind of numb horror. First, the luxury furnishings disappeared, then the carpets, then the household goods, then the kitchen equipment. Eventually, even the doors and window frames were taken. The Caliph's mother, the African woman who had once been the most powerful person in Egypt, who had directed military campaigns and run the administration, fled Egypt altogether. She went to Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate that the Fatimids had always considered their rivals and enemies. She preferred to live under her dynasty's rival than remain in Cairo. The humiliation was total. In the streets and villages of Egypt, the dying was now widespread. The chroniclers who wrote about this period described scenes that had not been seen in Egypt since the biblical plagues: masses of people too weak to move, bodies unburied because there was no one strong enough to bury them, people eating things that human beings had never been reduced to eating. Leather was boiled and consumed. Animals that had themselves starved were eaten. The chroniclers record cannibalism, documented cases of people killing and eating others, and of cannibals who had grown so brazen they operated in the open before being caught and executed. In a civilization that had prided itself on its sophistication and its cuisine and its commercial plenty, this was the horror that measured the depth of the collapse. While Egypt consumed itself, the Fatimid territories to the northeast slipped away. Palestine and Syria, the lands that included Jerusalem that the Fatimids had held for a century, were effectively undefended. The Turkish warlord Atsiz ibn Uvak, operating on behalf of the Seljuk Sultanate, moved into the region in the early 1070s. He took city after city, including Jerusalem in 1073. The Fatimids were too weak to mount any resistance. The caliphate that had controlled Jerusalem was too busy starving to fight for it. The most strategically important city in the medieval world changed hands without a real battle because the army that should have defended it was hundreds of miles away fighting over the scraps of a dying country. In 1073, Al-Mustansir sent a message. Not to the Ottoman army, not to the Abbasid Caliph, not to any of the great powers that surrounded Egypt. He sent it to Badr al-Jamali, an Armenian military commander who had served the Fatimids and was governing the small port city of Acre on the coast of Palestine. The message was, stripped of its diplomatic language, a plea: come to Cairo, restore order, save what is left. The offer was extraordinary, not just a military appointment, but the position of vizier, effective ruler of Egypt. Caliph al-Mustansir was asking a foreign-born Armenian general to come rescue him from his own army, and he was prepared to give that man nearly everything in exchange. Badr al-Jamali accepted, but he had conditions. He would not come with a small escort and try to negotiate with the faction commanders. He had seen what had happened to men who tried that. He came with his own army. Loyal Armenian soldiers he had recruited and trained himself, whose allegiance was to him personally, and who had no ties to the Turkish, Berber, or Sudanese factions currently destroying Egypt. He arrived at Alexandria in early 1074 and marched to Cairo. The faction commanders, still busy with their power struggles, did not fully understand what was coming. Badr's method was efficient and brutal. He invited the commanders of the Turkish, Berber, and Sudanese factions to meetings, individually and in small groups. The meetings ended with their deaths. One faction leader after another was killed, some in formal settings that turned suddenly violent, some ambushed, some executed on manufactured charges. Without their commanders, the factions lost cohesion. The remaining soldiers submitted or fled. Within months of his arrival, Badr al-Jamali had done what 7 years of famine and civil war had failed to do: unified Egypt under a single military authority. The authority was his own, not the caliph's, but it was authority. With order restored by violence, Egypt could begin to heal. The Nile floods, which had already begun recovering around 1072, cooperated with the political recovery. Fields were replanted. Markets reopened. What had been a cascade of disasters: low Nile, broken army, empty treasury, lost territory, slowly reversed: adequate Nile, unified army, rebuilding treasury, some territorial recovery. Badr al-Jamali took the title of vizier, commander of the armies, and supervisor of the religious establishment, an extraordinary concentration of power that made him, in practice, the ruler of Egypt. Al-Mustansir remained caliph. Ceremonies, prayers, the formal legitimacy of the Fatimid line, while Badr ran the country. The recovery was real but incomplete. The population of Egypt had been catastrophically reduced. Perhaps a third to half of the people who had been alive in 1065 were dead by 1073. The fields came back. The people did not for generations. Cairo rebuilt its markets and its commerce, but the library was gone. Those 100,000 volumes of accumulated learning that had made the Fatimid court one of the intellectual centers of the medieval world. They could not be rebuilt. Manuscripts that had been unique copies of ancient works were simply gone. The treasury was rebuilt slowly through taxation, but the centuries of accumulation that the Turks had looted could not be replaced in a decade or a generation. The Fatimids also did not get their territory back. Palestine and Syria remained in Seljuk hands. The Seljuks were not about to return what they had taken, and the Fatimids were in no position to take it by force. Jerusalem. The city that had been one of the jewels of the Fatimid Caliphate, whose religious importance was recognized by every faction in the medieval world, remained outside Fatimid control. The caliphate that had controlled Jerusalem for 100 years would never control it again. The structural consequence of the famine was a change in what the Fatimid Caliphate actually was. Before the famine, the caliphs had real power. Not always, and not always effectively, but the position carried genuine authority. After Badr al-Jamali, the caliphs were ceremonial figures, the pattern that Badr established. A strong military vizier who ran the country while the caliph provided religious legitimacy became the permanent structure of Fatimid rule for the remaining century of the dynasty. The caliphs who followed al-Mustansir were, with few exceptions, puppets of their own viziers. The famine had not just destroyed people and property, it had destroyed the institution of caliphal authority itself. The vizier system that emerged from the famine produced increasingly extreme examples of concentrated power. Badr al-Jamali's son Al-Afdal succeeded him as vizier and ran Egypt for another 20 years. Then a series of competing military strongmen fought over the vizierate while the Fatimid caliphs watched from their palaces. Some caliphs tried to reassert authority and were killed or deposed. Others accepted their ceremonial role and lived long, comfortable lives, signing documents for men who actually ruled. The dynasty that had once maintained the largest library in the world was now primarily useful as a source of religious legitimacy for whoever was strong enough to control Egypt at any given moment. The Seljuk takeover of Palestine that the famine enabled had consequences far beyond the Fatimid Caliphate. The Seljuks were less tolerant of Christian pilgrims than the Fatimids had been. Reports of violence against pilgrims, restrictions on access to the holy sites, and the general instability of the region reached Europe throughout the 1070s and 1080s. In 1095, Pope Urban II preached the First Crusade at Clermont, calling on the Christian knights of Europe to march to the Holy Land and free Jerusalem from Muslim rule. The crusade that resulted in the conquest of Jerusalem in 1099 was responding partly to the chaos created by the Fatimid famine of 1065 to 1072. The Fatimid Caliphate had also been a remarkable experiment in religious tolerance by medieval standards. Under most Fatimid caliphs, Christians and Jews served in the administration. The Coptic Church functioned openly. Jewish merchants operated freely in the commercial networks. This was not universal. Al-Hakim's mad persecutions were an exception, but it was the general pattern. After the famine, with the vizierate system and the general militarization of society, the space for this kind of cosmopolitan tolerance narrowed. Egypt became a more typically medieval Islamic state. Jews and Christians protected but subordinate, the administration increasingly militarized, the intellectual culture of the House of Knowledge never rebuilt. The loss of the Fatimid library deserves its own moment of grief. The medieval Islamic world was the great preserver and transmitter of ancient knowledge. When the Western Roman Empire fell and Europe entered its early medieval period, it was Islamic scholars, working in Baghdad, Cairo, Cordoba, who preserved, translated, and extended the works of Aristotle, Galen, Euclid, Ptolemy. The Fatimid House of Knowledge in Cairo was one of the greatest nodes in that network. Its contents, the exact holdings are unknown because no catalog survived, almost certainly included unique manuscript copies of works that no longer exist in any form. What was burned as fuel in 1067 cannot be recovered. It simply does not exist anymore. The famine also illuminated a vulnerability that every complex society inherits, the single point of failure. Egypt was the most productive agricultural land in the medieval world precisely because the Nile made it so. But that dependence on a single water system made the entire civilization fragile in a way that a more geographically diverse empire would not have been. When the Ethiopian rains failed, there was no backup. The granaries had a finite bottom. The treasury could not print more grain. And unlike a military threat, which could be answered with a military response, a hydrological failure could not be fought or negotiated with. The end of the Fatimid Caliphate, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic. In 1169, Saladin, the Kurdish military genius who would go on to unite the Islamic world and reconquer Jerusalem from the Crusaders, was sent to Egypt by his Zengid Turkish patron to help the Fatimid vizier of the moment against a rival. Within 2 years, Saladin had outmaneuvered everyone, taken control of Egypt, and decided that the Fatimid Caliphate was an embarrassment. In 1171, he ordered that the Friday prayer, the great public prayer in which the caliph's name was formally acknowledged, be said in the name of the Abbasid Caliph of Baghdad instead of the Fatimid Caliph. The last Fatimid Caliph, Al-Adid, was ill. He died a few days later, probably without knowing that his dynasty had just been ended. There was no revolt, no uprising, no army willing to fight for the Fatimid cause. Saladin understood exactly what he had inherited. Egypt was rich again. Badr al-Jamali's reforms had produced a century of recovery, and the Nile had been cooperating. The commercial networks were functioning. The military was under control. What Egypt did not have was the intellectual culture it had possessed before 1065. Saladin was a man of war and governance, not letters. He had no particular interest in rebuilding a library. He converted Egypt to Sunni Islam, the first Sunni governance of Egypt in 200 years, and turned his attention to the Crusaders in Palestine. The Fatimid experiment was over. Its intellectual legacy, what survived of it, passed into other hands. The First Crusade's conquest of Jerusalem in 1099 had an irony that the Fatimids would have appreciated bitterly. Within days of the Crusader conquest, the Fatimids sent an embassy to the Crusader leaders proposing a division of Palestine. The Fatimids had just retaken Jerusalem from the Seljuks in 1098 and were already negotiating with the new Christian invaders. The Crusaders rejected the proposal and attacked the Fatimid army at Ascalon a few weeks after taking Jerusalem. The Caliphate that had originally controlled Jerusalem was now sending diplomats to discuss sharing it with European knights. The distance from al-Mustansir sitting on his mat in 1067 to Fatimid diplomats at Crusader camps in 1099 was the measure of how completely the famine had altered the world. What the Fatimid Caliphate had built in its golden century was not entirely lost. Cairo survived. Al-Azhar survived. It still functions today as one of the most important centers of Islamic learning in the world, over 1,000 years after Jawhar al-Sakili founded it. The architectural monuments of Fatimid Cairo, the Al-Hakim Mosque, the Al-Akmar Mosque, the city walls built by Badr al-Jamali himself, still stand. The pattern of Cairo's streets, the basic urban geography of the city, reflects the Fatimid grid that Jawhar planned in 969. Some things built well enough survive everything, including 7 years without rain. The Ethiopian highlands where the Nile rains fall and fail. They never knew what they had done. The drought that reduced the Nile for 7 years was not a human decision. No one chose it. No one could have prevented it. And yet it destroyed a library, impoverished a caliph, killed perhaps 2 million people, handed Jerusalem to the Seljuks, enabled the Crusades, and ended a 200-year-old dynasty. The mechanisms by which weather in one place becomes catastrophe in another are always the same, a chain of dependencies, each one reasonable on its own, that becomes collectively catastrophic when the first link breaks. Al-Mustansir himself survived. He sat on his mat in 1067 and he was still alive in 1094. 27 more years of ceremonial caliph, signing documents, presiding over ceremonies, his name spoken in prayers across Egypt. He outlived Badr al-Jamali by a few months, dying in the same year as the man who had rescued him. His 58-year reign, the longest of any Fatimid caliph, encompassed both the dynasty's last real greatness and its definitive collapse. He was 7 years old when they made him caliph. He was 65 when he died. In between, the library, the treasury, the mat, the rescue, and a lifetime of being the most important figurehead in the room. The Nile has flooded every year since. It has flooded lower and higher, and the modern Aswan Dam has tamed its variability since 1970. But the fundamental relationship, that Egypt is the Nile, and the Nile is what the Ethiopian highlands send down, remains. What changed after the Fatimid famine was not the Nile. What changed was the caliphate, the library, the population, and the balance of power in the medieval Middle East. The Nile itself, indifferent as it has always been to the civilizations it sustains and occasionally destroys, continued on its 1,000-mile journey from the highlands to the sea, carrying the black silt that had once made Egypt the granary of the ancient world. The Fatimid experiment in Ismaili Shia governance of Egypt is one of the what-ifs of history. They were 200 years of relative religious tolerance in a medieval world that was not known for it. They built institutions that lasted. Al-Azhar is still there. They created a commercial network that made Egypt the hub of world trade. They accumulated knowledge when knowledge was rare and precious, and they lost it. Not to a superior enemy, not to a superior ideology, not to internal moral failure. They lost it to 7 consecutive years of low rainfall in the Ethiopian highlands, which they could not have predicted, could not have prevented, and could not have survived without help. The 7 years of the Great Crisis, 1065 to 1072, are a useful corrective to the idea that history is primarily driven by great men and their decisions. Al-Mustansir made many decisions during the famine. None of them mattered very much. The faction commanders made decisions. Atsiz ibn Uvak made decisions. Badr al-Jamali made decisions. The decisions that mattered most were made by rainfall patterns and river hydrology in the mountains of Ethiopia. The human drama, the looted treasury, the fled mother, the mat on the floor, the desperate letter to an Armenian general, was the consequence of a natural event playing out through the institutions that humans had built. The institutions the Fatimids had built were, in the end, more fragile than they looked. The army that depended on regular pay and fell apart when the pay stopped. The treasury that depended on agricultural tax revenue and emptied when the harvest failed. The caliphal authority that depended on the ability to pay the army and collapsed when the army turned predatory. Each institution was load-bearing for the others, and when the agricultural foundation gave way, they all fell together. It was not the Nile's fault for being low. It was the caliphate's vulnerability to that single point of failure that made the low Nile a civilization-ending event. One more thing was lost in the famine that is harder to measure than books or territory or population. The Fatimid claimed to be the alternative caliphate, the true heir of the Prophet's family, the legitimate leadership of the Islamic world against the Abbasid pretenders in Baghdad. That claim required power. It required the ability to protect Jerusalem, to maintain the Great Library, to project military force, to make the Abbasid Caliphate look weak by comparison. After the famine, none of that was possible. The Fatimid Caliph had fled to Baghdad, the enemy city, to survive. The library that was supposed to embody Fatimid intellectual superiority had been burned for fuel. The claim continued in name. The substance had been eaten by the drought. In 1067, a man who ruled more of the important world than almost anyone alive sat on a reed mat in an empty palace and waited. He controlled, in theory, Egypt and Jerusalem and the Red Sea trade and the largest library on earth. In practice, he controlled the mat. 7 years of low rainfall in Ethiopia had unwound a century of Fatimid achievement. The library gone, the treasury gone, the army gone predatory, the territory going to Seljuks, the population dying in the streets, his own mother fleeing to the enemy. An Armenian general would eventually come to rescue him, and Egypt would recover. But the caliphate that had once been the greatest rival to Baghdad was finished as a real power. The rains returned. The Nile flooded. The empire did not.